What is the Pact of Ice and Fire? What did it mean when it was agreed during the Dance of the Dragons, and what implications does it have for the wider story of A Song of Ice and Fire? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into George R. R. Martin's world of Ice and Fire. If you're new here, welcome. This video is co-produced with the wonderful History of Westeros. Please do check out their channel and podcast. There's a link in the description. And this is your usual spoiler warning. We're primarily talking here about the books, but there will probably be spoilers for House of the Dragon, so proceed with caution. Just before the full breakout of hostilities in the Dance of the Dragons, Prince Jacaerys flew north on his dragon Vermax on a diplomatic mission to secure the loyalty of three powerful nobles: Lady Jane Arryn, Lady Paramount of the Vale, Lord Desmond Manderley of White Harbour, and our focus for this video, Lord Cregan Stark, Lord Paramount of the North. Lady Jane was the easiest to convince, requiring only the pledge of a dragon rider to protect the Vale in return for their armies. Lord Manderley was old enough to have given his oath directly to Rhaenyra when she was a girl and stuck by that, but in doing so reminded Jacaerys of Princess Visera Targaryen, who was meant to marry his own great-grandfather Manderley many years ago, only to die before the wedding in a tragic accident. A heavy hint that Lord Manderley would like another marriage to make up for that one that never happened. Jacaerys obliged by offering the hand of his brother Joffrey to Lord Manderley's youngest daughter. Sadly, this marriage would also not ever take place. Joffrey was not long for this world. With all of the Vale and White Harbour sworn to his mother's side, Prince Jacaerys proceeded to Winterfell to treat with Cregan Stark. No doubt he meant to start with an appeal to Lord Cregan's honour. Cregan's father Rickard had sworn to support Rhaenyra years earlier, and everyone knows how honourable the Starks are. But we don't read anything about that in Fire and Blood. Instead, we get this, apparently from Munken's account. Cregan and Jacaerys took a liking to each other, for the boy prince reminded the Lord of Winterfell of his own younger brother who had died 10 years before. They drank together, hunted together, trained together, and swore an oath of brotherhood, sealed in blood. They might also have heard the tragic news by then of Prince Lucerys' death at Storm's End, which adds a touching element to this new friendship. Cregan Stark took a liking to Prince Jacaerys in part because he reminded him of his own deceased brother. Perhaps Jacaerys took a liking to Cregan because he too had just lost his brother. In fact, they had quite a lot in common, those two. Both lords, both born and brought up, told they would rule one day, both losing their fathers at a young age, and a brother, and both having faced a relative launching a coup. Cregan's uncle had ruled as regent until just a few years earlier and refused to hand back his powers when Cregan came of age. So perhaps it is no surprise that Lord Cregan agreed to affirm his father's sworn oath to Rhaenyra, or that he requested a marriage to seal the deal, not unlike Lord Manderley had requested and received. But it might be a surprise that he requested a Targaryen princess, Jace's firstborn daughter, to marry into his family, rather than sending a daughter to them, as was more typical and as Lord Manderley had. The Pact called for this yet unborn girl to be fostered at Winterfell from age 7, so she would become accustomed to the north while still young. One could argue that Cregan had but one son and no daughters at the time, so asking for a daughter was his only choice, but Cregan was 21 years old, fully capable of having more children, and indeed he did have daughters later on in his life. More to the point, Jace had no daughters either, nor did he have a sister, so any marriage promise between Stark and Targaryen at this time hinged on at least one child who hadn't yet been born. Lord Cregan comes across as very straightforward and direct, but he may have been more cunning than the histories perceived at this request for a Targaryen daughter. If Rhaenyra won, it would cement the idea that the firstborn would or could inherit regardless of their own sex, so it would pave the way for future queens and claims by women in general on the Iron Throne. This firstborn daughter of Jacaerys, if she were his firstborn child full stop, would be the heir to the Iron Throne after him. Cregan's grandchildren would rule the Seven Kingdoms. Not to mention the potential for Starks to claim dragons in the future, which might seem like quite a far-fetched idea on the surface, but as a brown-eyed, brown-haired dragon rider himself, one accused of being a bastard, the prince seems not to have held the same ideas of exclusivity where dragon riding is concerned compared to his ancestors. If low-born bastards like the dragon seeds Jace himself called for could ride dragons, why not Starks? Which leads to an even deeper rabbit hole, because there is another story of something that happened during that trip that relates to this. Mushroom claims that Jace's dragon Vermax laid a clutch of eggs in the crypts of Winterfell where the hot springs run. The suggestion seems to be that the fires of the earth are hot enough beneath Winterfell to mimic the conditions of a place where the dragons are regularly hatched and spawned, which is to say, near volcanoes. Now, it doesn't seem particularly plausible that a dragon large enough to ride could fit through the passageways in order to get that deep into the crypts. We've seen characters descend those stairs and they are not particularly wide, but maybe there is a secret way into the crypts from the outside, like a cave or a steam vent that humans couldn't survive, or perhaps a human placed the eggs there. If Vermax had laid some eggs in Winterfell and Jacaerys had promised his firstborn daughter would be brought up there, it makes some kind of sense for him to leave those eggs there. Targaryen children are always given dragon eggs. Or instead of a hidden entrance, perhaps we should be looking for a hidden meaning. Perhaps all this is foreshadowing for Jon Snow, half-dragon himself, who has dreams that he doesn't belong in the crypts of Winterfell, and just so happens to be dead but not at rest. He could be the ice dragon that hatches in this interpretation. Jon Snow also represents our potential to see what happens when a skin changer bonds with a dragon. There's no reason to think this is a new idea, however. Those two powers merged into one individual could be an ancient concept. And there is one other possibility raised by the TV show, which is that by the time Jace travels north, he has been told about Aegon the Conqueror's dream and the existential threat from the north. This will obviously match up well with the Starks' historic role and legends from the First Long Night. Might the two of them have reaffirmed some now long-forgotten pact between Aegon and King Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, say? Or come to some new understanding? So maybe the Pact of Ice and Fire was not just a marriage pact, but something deeper. That might explain why it was given such a cool name, unlike the Manderley marriage pact or pretty much any other marriage pact you could mention. Whether or not Cregan Stark had any of these ideas or level of awareness remains unknown. It's very possible, if rather dull, that he just got on well with Jacaerys and decided to honour his father's promise, and in doing so thought he might get an advantageous marriage out of it. Either way, it did not come to pass. The Pact of Ice and Fire, as it became known, was never fulfilled. There are no dragon-riding Starks now or then, until perhaps Jon Snow fits that mould. We shall see. The mention of Jon Snow, though, brings us to the other story Mushroom tells of that visit, the matter of Sara Snow. Like Jon, Sara was supposedly a bastard of Winterfell. She was said to be Lord Cregan's half-sister, and Mushroom claims the prince fell hard for her immediately, leading to them spending the night together. Lord Cregan was angered when he heard of this, but backed down when they told him they had married before sleeping together, swearing the traditional oaths in front of the Winterfell heart tree. A marriage in secret would be quite a scandal indeed, not the least of which is that the prince was already betrothed to Baelor Targaryen, but Mushroom claims that this is what led to the Pact of Ice and Fire. Yet Mushroom is the only source to even mention Sara Snow at all. There's no other corroboration that she ever existed, let alone married Prince Jacaerys, and no other textual clues to support it. He certainly doesn't take her back to Dragonstone with him or seemingly tell anyone there about it, nor does Cregan reference it when he turns up at King's Landing at the end of the war. And if Jacaerys was married to Cregan's half-sister, that would mean that his daughter, who was promised in the pact, would be Cregan's son's half-first cousin or something close. The Targaryens may have been rather relaxed about the whole incest side of things, but the Northerners were less so. Still, whether the Sara Snow story is true or not, some compelling parallels and echoes emerge from the stories surrounding the Pact of Ice and Fire. In A Song of Ice and Fire, Robb Stark heard that his brothers were killed at Winterfell while he was recovering from his wound at the Crag, seat of House Westerling. We're told that the shared grief and time spent with Lady Jane is what led to their relationship, marriage, and subsequent tragedy. Another parallel is, of course, Prince Rhaegar's doomed relationship with Lyanna Stark, two characters among the most associated with the series title A Song of Ice and Fire, a name with clear similarity to the Pact of Ice and Fire. Furthermore, both Rhaegar and Jacaerys held the title Prince of Dragonstone. Ultimately, many of these parallels depend on timing and interpretation, as we don't know when exactly Prince Jacaerys learned of his brother's death in the books, nor if Sarah Snow was a real person, or if the tale about Vermax's alleged eggs has any merit. Such is the nature of competing historical sources, complicated by their known biases. What we do know for sure is that as a result of Jace's visit, a large host of Northerners marched south, led by Lord Roderick Dustin, aka Roddy the Ruin, with another to follow later in the war, led by Lord Cregan Stark himself. The split force was not just some way to get some soldiers down south as soon as possible, it was also imperative that there was enough workforce in the north to bring in the harvest first. A hard winter would be coming very soon. The events of the Dance of the Dragons resulted in both the Blacks and the Greens devastated, with most of the dragons and their riders fallen during the various conflicts and intrigues. Thus it is perhaps no surprise that the Blacks were unable to fulfill the Pact of Ice and Fire, nor even their marriage alliance with House Manderley. The princess that was promised was an unkept promise. Nor was there much of anyone left to blame for the Blacks' failure to uphold their end of the bargain, yet the question remains why it wasn't fulfilled later. We noted earlier that Lord Manderley reminded Prince Jacaerys of an earlier marriage promise, and that swayed him, but we have no evidence that either the Manderley or the Stark marriage pact was ever raised again. Perhaps we just haven't read about it yet, because it seems unlikely to have been entirely forgotten. The North remembers, after all. But perhaps there was no resolution. If the Manderleys wanted a politically advantageous marriage to the Targaryens, then that idea ended when Aegon III dismissed Lord Manderley as Hand of the King. Indeed, the penultimate sentence of Fire and Blood tells us that Aegon had made an enemy of Lord Manderley in that moment. And if the theory that Cregan Stark was angling for dragons in the north is true, he might have given up on that simply because nearly every dragon died during the war, and died out completely during his lifetime. He also chose a Blackwood bride for himself when he might have insisted on marrying Princess Rhaena Targaryen, say. Perhaps there's not much to read into here, since accounts are clear that Cregan simply fell in love with Aly Blackwood, which negated any potential ambitions he might have had. Most of his later life falls into that lesser-known window after the dance, however. We do, though, know of one final twist. The son Cregan meant to marry to a Targaryen girl, Rickon, married Jane Manderley instead. The two houses that didn't get their Targaryen spouses married each other, strengthening the fraternal bonds in the north rather than tying the north closer to the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. And ultimately, it is perhaps this mundane matter of who marries who that impacts most on the story of Targaryen rule. Yes, there are the thematic and foreshadowing links across to Rhaegar and Lyanna, and yes, the renewing of any more prophecy-based alliance would surely have been important, but skipping forward a bit in time, the root reason why the Targaryens finally lost power, as well as them no longer having dragons, was because they didn't have many allies. And they didn't have allies because they kept marrying their own family rather than forging alliances through marriage with the powerful families in the realm like the Starks. We know why, of course, and perhaps they were right to do so, but the history of the Seven Kingdoms and A Song of Ice and Fire would have been very different if the Pact of Ice and Fire and other alliances like it had bound the kingdom together, rather than cemented the Targaryens as a race apart. If you'd like more videos like this, diving deep into the lore of A Song of Ice and Fire, there's a playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or if you'd like to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.